This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this episode 936 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. We saw a little bit of week-over-week improvement with last week's sleeper episode, but there were still some big misses. The Tampa Bay wide receivers weren't nearly as good as I thought they would be. Dontavian Wicks was a flop. Jalen Tolbert was too. And Tyler Boyd didn't take advantage of a good matchup. But I did call out Jameis Winston, and I called out Cedric Tillman too. Bo Nix was an awesome streamer. Braylon Allen found the end zone, and so did Jaleel McLaughlin. It was another below average week, but it was at least better than that crappy one that I had in week 7. Now, before getting into the week 9 sleepers, I wanted to remind you that even though you drafted your fantasy teams back in August, you can still do snake drafts right now over on Underdog. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. In the draft section, click NFL and you'll see tons of drafts that you can participate in right now. And if you're new to Underdog, make sure to sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit bonus as well as my rest of season rankings. Those rankings are updated for you each Tuesday once you get the link to them. But to get them, you have to sign up, use promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. We'll kick things off with players rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues, but more than 10% of them. And as usual, we'll start with some quarterback streamers. Bo Nix has been on fire, at least in fantasy football. He's averaged almost 22 standard fantasy points per game over his last 4. And 2 of those games came against opponents who rank in the bottom half of the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. Denver gets Baltimore this week. The Ravens have been thrown on this year. Only the Buccaneers have seen a higher pass rate against them in neutral script environments. And the Ravens are allowing an extra 71 passing yards to be thrown against them versus their opponent's season-long average. Meaning we should expect Bo Nix to throw more passing yards than he typically throws for. There's some concern about Denver's low team total this week. But as a fantasy asset, Nix is not in a bad spot. Derek Carr should be back this week, and the Saints get the Panthers. We know that's a plus matchup. Carolina has been putrid defensively this year. They've given up the 3rd most adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks, and they've got a bottom tier pressure rate. They've given up a QB1 performance in 4 of their last 5 games. And the last time that Derek Carr faced them back in week 1, he completed 19 of 23 passes and threw for 3 touchdowns. The Saints have almost a 26-point implied team total this week. That makes Carr an okay play. Now, moving on to running back, as usual, it's tough to find reliable players at the position off the waiver wire. But Tyler Algier is rostered in 37% of leagues. I don't mind him against Dallas this week. The game between Atlanta and Dallas looks like it's going to be one of the fastest paced ones on the slate. We may see a lot of back and forth action and more plays run. That's going to favor all of the players involved in the game. Dallas has faced a bottom 5 pass rate against them this year in neutral game script environments because they've been bad against the run. Team running backs have seen 16 more rushing yards per game against Dallas versus their season-long averages. The Cowboys are the 7th best matchup for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, Algier's been flip-flopping between lower running back rush shares and higher ones over the last 5 weeks. But last week, he did see 48% of Atlanta's running back rushes. If they go with a ground-heavy approach, he could see double-digit touches in this game. Another running back who may have some appeal in deeper formats is Zach Charbonnet. He's seen at least a 25% running back rush share in every game over his last 4. He's actually hit a double-digit percentage target share in 2 of those games. Seattle gets a Rams team that's been pretty average for running backs when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. But they've been a bottom 10 team at preventing running back rushing yards. So in a pinch, maybe you get like 10 touches from Charbonnet in a game that could end up being high scoring. And then I'm going to shout out Ray Davis here too. Look, all of these running back plays, they're shaky because people roster all the usable running backs. But Davis has seen running back rush shares of 29% and 25% over his last 2 games. And he's been efficient with his touches basically since his week 6 breakout against the Jets. The Bills get Miami this week. It's a game where they're at home as 6.5-point favorites. The game has a high over-under, giving Buffalo a massive team total of almost 28. And Miami's been a team that struggled against the run way more than the pass this year. They're actually the best team in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks according to my numbers, and they're 8th worst against running backs. In neutral scripts, they faced a bottom 5 pass rate. Teams are running the ball against Miami. This is more of a desperation play, there's no doubt. Definitely more so than a player like Tyler Algier. But that's where we're at this year with these waiver wire running backs. And there surprisingly aren't that many injuries across the league at the position. Now moving on to wide receiver, let's just talk about the Carolina guys. Xavier Legette is rostered in about 21% of Yahoo leagues. Jalen Coker, only 2% of them. Now I think Legette is the preferred choice, but I don't have their projections massively far apart this week, assuming they run out the same guys as they did last week. They get the Saints, as I just talked about. New Orleans has been the 11th best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted points allowed this year. So the matchup isn't anything that we should be overly worried about. A higher percentage of wide receiver targets have gone to the slot against New Orleans than most teams. They rank just outside the top 10 in slot target share allowed. That's adjusted for strength of opponent. And they've been well below average in slot targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns allowed, which is why Coker is kind of interesting. He's been operating as Carolina's primary slot guy. He was at an 80% slot rate last week according to PFF, and he led the team in week 7 too. So Legette is a safer option because of the talent profile and sort of the steadiness of his role. But don't forget about Coker this week either. Like I said before, I really like this Falcons-Cowboys game. There's a nice over-under, there should be a good pace, and there are quarterbacks who can sling it if necessary. That means that Jalen Tolbert, once again, is a sleeper. His target shares have not been that great, I'm not going to lie. He's been below a 12% target share in 4 of his last 5 games. But he's still getting up to a 90% route participation. There's an avenue here where even if he's only at a 15% target share or so, that's enough for him to produce against a top 10 team for wide receivers by adjusted fantasy points allowed. We're getting a switch to Joe Flacco in Indianapolis. That's great news for fantasy football. Josh Downs and Michael Pittman, they're going to be more reliable now. And I think that we can look at Alec Pierce too. People kind of make the assumption that Pierce is just going to be better with Anthony Richardson given how he started his season. But don't forget that he had a monster game against Jacksonville with Joe Flacco, at least from a production standpoint. His target share wasn't great, but he got there. The bottom line is that all of these pass catchers and players on this team, they're better off in fantasy with Joe Flacco. And Pierce is running routes on about 80% of the team's dropbacks right now. The AD Mitchell takeover has not happened. And this week, the Colts get the Vikings. Teams against the Vikings have thrown on average 72 more yards than their season-long averages. That's the most in the league. Minnesota has given up an average of 298 passing yards over their last 3 games. And teams are throwing it 15 plus air yards against the Vikings at the 5th highest rate in the league. As we know, Alec Pierce, a big play guy. He's a super volatile player, but that's all why he can hit this week. The Buccaneers get the Chiefs. The Chiefs' defense is bad news for basically anything fantasy football. But we're looking for volume here. And there could be some volume for Jalen McMillan and even Sterling Shepard. Now we have to see if Shepard is fully healthy. But the reason I'm calling him out, and he's a deep sleeper for the record, but it's because he played the slot for the Buccaneers this past week. And guess which team has been targeted in the slot most this year in the entire NFL when adjusted for strength of opponent? That's right, the Kansas City Chiefs. Now that could mean big things for Cade Otton once again. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the outcome here. Because Kansas City, they've kind of struggled against tight ends this year. But it could mean okay enough production for Sterling Shepard. And then Jalen McMillan's just getting a call out here because number 1, he could play some in the slot too. But number 2, he's coming off a game where he had a 90% route participation and a 15% target share. Now, I don't feel great about either option because this matchup is not awesome, but that's kind of the name of the game with these sleepers. I feel better about Elijah Moore this week, if I'm being honest. The Browns don't get nearly as juicy of a matchup this week when they face the Chargers, and this could end up being a pretty slow game. That's not good for fantasy. LA is also a bottom 10 matchup for wide receivers when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, on the plus side, Elijah Moore is coming off a game where he saw a 29% target share. And for what it's worth, the Chargers rank 10th in adjusted slot target share allowed to wide receivers. Teams are targeting the slot at a slightly higher than normal rate when facing LA. And since Amari Cooper left town, Moore has played in the slot on about 70% of his snaps. So I don't mind him as a sleeper. Now, the first tight end that I've got in this tier is Zach Ertz. The matchup on paper, it's kind of whatever, But Ertz now has 3 consecutive top 12 performances in PPR formats. He's coming off a game where he hit a 32% target share. That's hard to find at tight end. So go ahead and stream him. And then I'm going back to Taysom Hill. I talked about him on the 15 Transaction Show earlier this week, but there are injuries and openings across the entire Saints offense right now. That could lead to more work for Taysom Hill both on the ground and through the air. And he gets one of the best matchups imaginable this week when they face Carolina. The Saints have a super high implied team total like I talked about earlier. So I think Taysom Hill is kind of a good play. We're now looking at players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues, and the obvious go-to quarterback this week is Joe Flacco. I talked earlier with Alec Pierce about how Minnesota's secondary hasn't been great of late. They've watched their opponents throw for 72 more yards than their season-long averages. Flacco has a legit chance to throw for 300 yards this weekend, and the Vikings have been a top 10 team this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, in terms of being a favorable matchup. So he's one of the better options that you're going to find this year in this sub 10% bucket. Now, I've been targeting backup running backs who face the Panthers because backup running backs have crushed the Panthers this year. Within context, in 5 of 8 games, a backup running back has scored double-digit PPR points against Carolina. Now, that could either be Jamal Williams or Kendre Miller this week, depending on Kendre Miller's status. But right now, it doesn't sound great for Miller, putting Williams directly in that backup role. He could see a decent number of touches in that game if the game script goes the Saints' way. I talked about Jalen Coker already in this tier, so let's move on to a pretty obvious pick in Parker Washington. Christian Kirk, he's done for the year. Brian Thomas, he's banged up. Gabe Davis, he's banged up. Even if Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis play this weekend, Parker Washington is basically the new Christian Kirk. I'd anticipate him playing that role. Now, if one or both of those wideouts is out, there's an even higher target share ceiling for Washington. And the Jags could see a negative game script this week because they get the Eagles. They're 7.5 point underdogs. Philly's a slightly below average matchup for wide receivers, but volume alone could get Washington into flex status this week. We've got some banged up wide receivers in Houston too. We have Nico Collins still on IR and Stephon Diggs is out for the year. So it's Tank Dell. And then some other wide receivers that we have to figure out. If you look at last week's numbers, according to PFF, Tank Dell ran 30 routes, Stephon Diggs was at 28, and Xavier Hutchinson was at 26. Then it was John Mechie and Robert Woods, who were only at 9 and 8 routes run. Hutchinson played an identical number of snaps as Stephon Diggs did out of the slot. So I think he's going to have more of like an inside-outside role than what we're going to see out of Robert Woods and John Mechie. So I think he's the safest option of those 3, which is why I'm going to shout him out on today's Sleeper Show. You guys remember Trey Tucker? Remember when everything was up in the air with Devontae Adams and people were really excited about Tucker? Well, he's been pretty bad in fantasy over his last 4 games. Aside from team environment, one reason why is because the Raiders have faced the Broncos, Steelers, and Chiefs during that stretch. That's brutal. Tucker's running routes on well over 90% of the team's dropbacks right now without Adams. And they get a much more advantageous matchup this week against the Bengals. Cincinnati is the 6th best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I think that Tucker's kind of an interesting prayer this week. Lastly, at wide receiver, Noah Brown. He's still only rostered in 2% of Yahoo leagues, despite target shares of 18% and 24% in 2 of his last 3 games. Now, he obviously scored a lot of points last week because of that Hail Mary, but his route participation was at 81%. That's not bad. This week, the Commanders get the Giants. New York has been beat more so in the perimeter this season, which is where Noah Brown will line up. And they've been an average team in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. So I think you could do worse. We've got 2 tight ends in this tier. First is Jonnu Smith, who's in play for 2 main reasons. Number 1, Miami may be forced to have a relatively high pass-heavy script. But more importantly, Smith has seen target shares of 26%, 32%, and 16% over his last 3. Over his last 2, his route participation has been 78% and 70%. Those are not bad numbers for a tight end. I don't love him, but I do think that he makes sense as a dart throw. Chig Okonkwo is kind of in the same spot. There's no DeAndre Hopkins anymore for the Titans, and over Chig's last 4 games, he's seen his route participation rise by about 15 to 20 percentage points. That's resulted in target shares in that 12 to 15% range. The Titans get the Patriots this week. It's a totally average matchup. But Chig might start to get a little bit more involved in this offense with so few alternatives. That's why he's kind of interesting. But I'm not going to lie, this week overall, it's just kind of a tough one. I'll be happy if like 4 or 5 of these picks really hit. But I know that some of you are in trouble, so I did my best to get you something. Now at defense this week, I talked about New Orleans already on the 15 transactions episode. They're definitely in play. I also think Washington and that improved defense, they work against New York. And really either defense in that Tennessee-New England game, they work as streamers too. And then lastly, let's get our pick 'em on over at Underdog. We're going to go higher than 214.5 passing yards for Bo Nix. He's been higher than that in 2 of his last 3. And we know that Baltimore generally gives up a lot more passing yards than the average defense. We'll also go higher than 40.5 receiving yards for Jalen Tolbert against the Falcons. He's actually been above that mark in all but 2 games this year. And this is a plus matchup. So Bo Nix and Jalen Tolbert. Let's ride. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag episode and another episode of Late Round Perspectives.